Hi everyone, I hope you are all doing well. Please do excuse my voice today if it does get a little bit groggy or there's a little bit of a cough. I'm recovering from a hectic cold. Okay, so let's get started. Excuse me. So today we are going to be looking at early state formation in Southern Africa, Mapungubwe. So this is a map that you see in front of you of the Mapungubwe region and other important sites. The Mapungubwe site is in Limpopo province on the border between South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Botswana. The site sits close to the point where the Limpopo and the Shashe River meet, as we can see here. So between AD 900 and 1300, a period known as the Middle Iron Age, African people in the Shashe Limpopo Basin developed the first complex society in southern Africa, characterized by the first political organization to be ruled by sacred leadership and distinct social classes. This society also created the first town, the first king, the first stone-walled palace, and the capital of the first state. This is a big deal. This is where kingdoms started in Southern Africa. So these are Southern Africa's first city. Now, in the next slide, we are going to look at the capitals. So as you can see here, we have each of the three capitals that represents a separate slice of time. Excuse me. So we first have Shronda, which is AD 900 to 1000. Then we have K2, 1000 to 1220. And then finally, we have Mapungubwe, which is 1220 to 1300. Now, the significance of Mapungubwe. The Mapungubwe cultural landscape was the center of the first kingdom in southern Africa, established by cultural ancestors of the present-day Shona and Venda. It includes over 400 archaeological sites and the three successive capitals, which are Shronda, K2, and Mapungubwe, occupied between AD 900 to 1300. The dynamic interaction between society and landscape during this period laid the foundation for a new type of social organization in Southern Africa. The kingdom grew as a result of two major factors. One, wealth accumulated from trade in gold, glass beads, cotton cloth, Chinese and local ceramics, ivory, copper, within the Indian Ocean network. So the second thing would be the ideal landscape and climatic conditions for agriculture that provided for a population of over 9,000 people. Now we're going to look at the Shashe Limpopo Basin. The Shashe Limpopo Basin lies in what geologists call the Limpopo Mobile Belt between two ancient continents, the Zimbabwe Craton and the Kapval Craton. So if you look at that timeline we looked at previously, that shows us the occupation of the Shashe Limpopo Basin, you will see that African farmers were absent from the Shashe Limpopo Basin between about AD 600 and 900, and that's because the climate was not suitable. So now during the Middle Iron Age, which is AD 900 to AD 1300, the population in the basin increases, it increased. And this coincides with greater emphasis on agriculture and domestic meat sources, beginning with the Leopard Kopje people who entered the basin at the beginning of around AD 1000. These farmers, now they came and they cultivated sorghum, millet, various legumes, and indigenous leafy vegetables, as well as they herded cattle, sheep, and goats. They were descendants of the Leopard Gobcha people that later constructed the capital city of K2, which stood until roughly about AD 1200. So now the climate would have supported dense forests with Ilala palms alongside the riverbanks. Though the forests have now mostly disappeared, the flood plains in the area still support salt bush. The natural features in the area played a part in the rise of Mapungubwe. You can see the image on the slide. The image shows a view over the confluence of the Limpopo and the Shashe rivers. So now in our next slide, we are going to be looking at Shronda, the capital. So Shronda is situated northeast of Mapungubwe. And like Mapungubwe, it overlooks the Limpopo River. The first people to move into the Shasha Limpopo Basin were the Zizo around AD 900. At about AD 900, the Zizo people moved into the Shasha Limpopo Basin, most likely to hunt elephants for the East Coast trade. So from AD 900, however, the climate improved and annual rainfall was expected to have increased between 350 to 450. So this seems to have varied across the landscape, right? So who are these Zizo people that I'm telling you about? So the Zizo people lived southwest Zimbabwe and eastern Botswana. Some Zizo people moved south from Zimbabwe in about AD 900 and established a settlement at Shronda. The Zizo were named after the characteristic pottery. The major Zizo settlement of Shronda was situated near the Limpopo River and connected to the Indian Ocean trade, as evidenced by the prevalence of large numbers of exotic glass beads that have been found there. So the primary attraction of the Shasha Limpopo Basin to the Zizo people was likely the elephant herds that likely inhabited the floodplain. Funny enough, there was a lack of Zizo settlements in the river bottom near prime agricultural ground. This is not to say that they were not practicing farming. So it has been estimated that about 300 to 500 people lived at Shronda. Shronda was the largest Zizo settlement at that time. It was the capital. It is assumed to have been the home to the wealthiest chief and therefore the capital city. Zizo people occupied the basin for approximately 100 years, reaching a population of approximately 1,075. Looking specifically at the settlement pattern of the region, it has been argued that most Zizo homesteads they do not cluster around the Limpopo floodplain, or more specifically, the fertile wetland which flooded seasonally. So the image we see right now in front of us shows us the Zizo settlements at the Mapungubwe landscape. One would expect the location of the settlement to be near the fertile land if agriculturists were primarily interested in cultivation. The wetland areas are a unique feature of the local landscape and offered prime fertile land. So these nutrient-rich zones could have been used during unfavorable environmental conditions, such as during the years of little rainfall and drought. There have been a few Zizo period sites identified near fertile ground, which were presumably planted with sorghum and millet and the primary crops during that time. So the way the Zizo settlements are distributed is linked to the high number of elephants in the basin. The settlements were away from the river and the floodplains to prevent elephants from destroying their fields. The Great Mapungubwe landscape was settled by Zizo agriculturists to access its large ivory. The landscape has unique ecological characteristics and resources that made the region suitable for agricultural settlement. These resources are a wide range of wildlife that could be hunted or trapped, a variety of wild plant resources that could be gathered as food, for building, carving, or for medicinal purposes. There was a year-round water supplies, cultivatable zones, and access to a large supply of ivory in the area. In the next slide, we see in the image clay figurines that were found at Shronda. So now these clay figurines were first found on a site in Shronda in the Limpopo River Valley. There are many dozens of these clay fertility figurines that were found at Shronda. It's over 2,000 figurines. Most of them were broken when they were found in Shronda, and the female initiation school used these figurines as props. Interesting. Okay. So now there were other figurines of things like animals, animal creatures, creatures of fantasy that were found next to the main kettle kraal. These figurines were also used to teach lessons about life and responsibility. In the image is one of the many birds that were found at Shonda. The figurine has a narrow tail, as you can see, with the wings molded separately on either side. The wings of the birds are white, and white was associated with ancestors. The other figurine is a male with an animal-like head, making it one part man and one part animal. Many of the figurines have a sex. Now we are going to be looking at trade. So trade contributed to the rise of Mapungubwe. The Arabs were attracted by trade along the African sea coast since before the birth of Christ. They had expanded their trade southwards. The trade on the east coast contributed to the rise of Mapungubwe in the 1200s. As Schroeder beads were introduced, adding a new currency with which to barter and trade. These beads came in as a result of the local people starting to trade artifacts and other goods with the people coming in from the east coast, the Arab Islamic traders. Shronda became a significant source of ivory for the Swahili merchants. There was a great demand for it in India and in China. More glass beads have been found in Shronda than all the other Iron Age sites in southern Africa put together. Zizo people controlled the Shasho Limpopo portion trade for about 100 years. The next slide, we're going to be looking at K2. So in about AD 1000, a new group of people attracted by trade and other opportunities moved into the basin. They sent the people of Shonda fleeing to the west, blocking them off from the east coast trade. The Leopold Koptu people took over this area. So the Zizo chiefdom moved west into Botswana. When the Leopold Koptu people took over the area, we see the replacement of Zizo pottery now. Because they have disappeared from the archaeological record, we do not know what language the Zizo people spoke. Around this time, AD 1000, pottery from the Leopold Koptu clusters, which is associated with Shona-speaking people, it appears in the basin and the neighboring areas, and it replaces the Zizo. So the Leopold Koptu pottery can be traced into more recent times. And that is how we know that the Leopold Koptu people spoke an early form of Shona, the major language family in Zimbabwe today. More specifically, they would have spoken Kalanga, that is Western Shona. K2 was the Leopold Koptu capital, the largest settlement in its day. It housed about 1,500 people with family head or ward head men. There were several residential areas, and the largest division belonged to the chief. They settled at the K2, which was 1 kilometers southwest of Mapungubwe. And then when we look at the court and the kraal, the court belonged to the leader of the settlement. The chief would hear cases that affected the nation there. At K2, the court was near the cattle kraal. The kraal was also a place where some men would spend their leisure time. The men were also buried in or near the cattle kraal. Lobola was an important social institution. The central kraal, therefore, was extremely important. The chiefs are believed to have lived on the western edge of the settlement, and the kraal was located at the front. So things like celebrations, rituals, and trade took place in the cattle kraal. It was the center of the community and the burial place for high-ranking members of society. Throughout the Eastern Bantu-speaking world, societies have arranged houses around a central cattle kraal. This had a symbolic relationship between women houses and graves. Now looking at the people of K2, many K2 people lived in small homesteads away from the capital. The men were situated in the inner center of the domain and the women in the outer residential area. The cattle kraal was found where men related by blood and other important people were buried, and a court where decisions were made and conflicts were resolved. The men's area had sunken grain pits for long-term use. Married women had their own kitchen, sleeping house, grain bins, and graves. These homesteads were grouped into neighborhoods, and each neighborhood had its own headman. K2 people were cultivating the rich soil near the Limpopo. K2 people cultivated sorghum, pearl millet, finger millet, ground beans, and cowpeas. These crops are said to be of African origin, and the Iron Age farmers brought them to southern Africa. So the population in the K2 capital and in the homesteads, it increased And as you can imagine, agricultural production would also what? It would also increase. There were designated fields for food, and that would be produced for the capital. Now let's look at a ruling class emerging in the K2 and elite control. So at K2, trade increased dramatically, and gold attracted more people to the area. With this source of prosperity, cattle was no longer the determining factor for wealth. The cattle were physically and symbolically moved to the periphery of the society, and the court midden was allowed to cover the old kraal. Midden is a heap of large pile of animal waste or waste material thrown away by human beings in the past. Okay. So at K2, they started manufacturing their own glass beads. They wanted to maintain the value of the beads. They were able to store up this wealth. This gave rise to class distinction. There was an unequal distribution of wealth. The royals kept the wealth in the upper class. The elite and the commoners, the people living in the homestead, were living side by side. But now something was changing in the society. The K2 was starting to move towards a separation between the leaders and the commoners. The royals at K2 made a decision to move to Mapungubwe Hill. After everything that we've learned so far, we need to ask ourselves, how did this development of formal class structure occur? There are two main factors we need to look at: trade and agriculture. The enormous wealth generated through the Indian Ocean trade resulted in an unprecedented inequality. The ruling families became an upper class, a growing population which was supported by floodplain agriculture would have helped to intensify the existing social differences. By AD 1220, K2 society had transformed from one based on social ranking to one based on social classes. There was something called rainmaking. So Mapungubwe was regarded as a rain-making center. The chief was in charge of this ritual, although they did not make the rain themselves. So rainmaking is a cyclical process that goes hand in hand with agriculture. It is actually a practice that is still practiced today by, I think, the Venda. The start of the rain season there are rituals that are done to summon the clouds. This is followed by people working on fields. There was a specific hill now that they used for rainmaking. The field had steep sides, which made it difficult for the cattle to access. K2 pottery and sorghum were found on the hill. These would have been used for making ritual beer. Here's something interesting. The rainmaking was sometimes people who were hired to do the work. The sand hunter-gatherers sometimes played this role. Sometimes it was the first inhabitants of the land, because they believed that the first inhabitants would have had a special relationship with the spirits, the ancient spirits of that land. So this can actually include some of the Zizo people who stayed behind. Now we're going to look at Mapungubwe. So now between AD 1220 and 1300, the Mapungubwe cultural landscape sustained a population of at least 9,000 people. So there was the regular flooding of the Limpopo River provided silt and water for the crops. Grazing lands enabled stock to be kept. Elephants were hunted for their ivory and other animals for their hides, while several steep-sided hills were used as ritual sites for rainmaking. At least one of them, Mapungubwe Hill, was gradually modified over the years. Anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 people lived in Mapungubwe. This is the largest known settlement anywhere in southern Africa at that time. Mapungubwe became the capital in AD 1220. Mapungubwe was only occupied as a capital for 50 to 80 years, less than half the duration of K2. When the royals at K2 made the decision to move to Mapungubwe, this was because it was to better suit their needs. This was the first time in the prehistory of Southern Africa that a senior leader physically separated from his followers. This new spatial pattern is associated with class distinction. Now, most people settled below the hill and in front of it. That is, on the west side, the commoners' court was established at the base of the hill, next to the tall boulder, and cattle were not associated with it. At Mapungubwe, people carried over 10,000 tons of sand up difficult paths to level up the hill, the king's residence, to level up the hill, the king's residence, where the king's residence was, to provide the foundation for the elite homesteads and burial grounds. The chief lived on the top of the hill, and the ordinary people lived below. The king was also separated because it was believed he had a special relationship with the ancestors. The leaders kept the hill to themselves. The ordinary members of the Mapungubwe society were not allowed in. Below was the king's court. The royals surrounded the hill, forming a protective circle around the king. So the royals were on the slopes of the hill. It was not easy to get to the king. It was not easy to access the king who lived up on that hill. So the king was isolated and he was protected, living with his wives, guards, advisors, and his healers. So people, you can see this image here. So people would have to climb the hill daily to bring supplies and provisions to the king or to pay tribute. There was a ritualization of leadership. The people glorified the king, even in every move, as he was seen as being the closest to the ancestors, therefore God. Like they glorified every move, his sneeze, every little thing that the king did. So this image is showing the construction of Mapungubwe. You can see the commoners would then have inhabited the lower lying sites, the district leaders occupying the small hilltops, the kingdom's elite residing at the capital of Mapungubwe Hill as they were the supreme authority. Important men maintained prestigious homes on the outskirts of the capital. So the king actually slept in a secret location. The king's messengers would receive visitors before taking them to the king. Also, these people who received visitors, they were trained to see and to tell if the visitor had good intentions or not. A reminder that the physical separation of the king from his subjects was an outward expression of sacred leadership. Now we're going to look at the court at Mapungubwe and the ways up the hill. So though the court was at the bottom of the hill, the king did not come down. Instead, his court was run by his brother, whom they would call Little Father. The king's brother was the second most powerful man in charge in the kingdom. He had other court officials that helped him to handle the court cases. Mapungubwe was accessible via steep and narrow paths. There were four stairways up the hill. These were actually holes that were drilled in the rocks with poles to help develop a stairway. So the path leading to the royal living area was guarded by soldiers too. The walls of Mapungubwe and its first town. The walling that was used at Mapungubwe was later used in Great Zimbabwe. There was different stone walling in Mapungubwe to help facilitate sacred leadership and class distinction. Stone walls were used as a demarcate important areas, and important residences were built with stone and wood. In AD 1250, Mapungubwe had about 5,000 people living there. It was Southern Africa's largest known settlement during the time and its first town. Now we're going to look at gold in Mapungubwe. So during the years of Mapungubwe, the demand for gold grew. The people of Mapungubwe had become skilled in the smelting of things like iron, and the smelting of gold was easier. There was a royal cemetery on Mapungubwe Hill. There was also gold burials up there. There are famous gold objects that were found on Mapungubwe Hill. Things like the famous gold rhino you can see just in front of you. The bowl, the scepter was found there. One of the men buried in Mapungubwe was holding the famous gold scepter across his arm when he was found buried. The rhino was constructed out of several pieces of fine gold foil, and the inner had pure gold nails. So it is said that the rhino symbolizes stubbornness and power, and may have been made in honor of a great king at Mapungubwe. The crafting of gold objects became their trademark. The white rhino was seen, they saw the white rhino as being docile and harmless. The black rhino was seen as powerful, it was dangerous, and leading a solitary life, and these were the attributes of who their leaders. Therefore, the black rhino was a symbol of leadership for them. So now we're going to be looking at Mapungubwe's internal and external trade. Mapungubwe had an extensive network with other areas. There were various resources scattered all over Mapungubwe that suggested that they traded with neighboring states. For example, the number of foreign pottery that presented its in we can see this in the number of foreign pottery that presented itself in Mapungubwe. There were fragments of Chinese Ceylon vessels indicating that there was certainly some trade of some sort with other states on the coast, who in turn traded with merchants traveling from India and Arabia by sea. The economic base of Mapungubwe included the Indian Ocean gold and ivory trade, as it had before with K2. The sheer volume of beads recovered in Mapungubwe is actually quite remarkable. The, the imported glass beads and the three Ceylon shards are a testimony to international trade. Determining the origins of these objects, the imported glass beads and the Chinese Ceylon shards, this helps us understand their origins, and also understanding the trade routes that were going on happening during that time around Africa and outside of Africa. In front of you, this is an image of a Chinese celadon shards of the Lengquan type, believed to date from southern the Song Tong dynasty. So now this connects Mapungubwe to the extensive maritime trade network established already in the 1st century AD, which linked East Africa commercial systems to the Indian Ocean. African raw materials such as gold, rhinoceroses, horn, ivory, ambergris, frankincense, and myrrh were exchanged for cotton, porcelain, and glass trade beads. Now we're going to look at climate change and the decline of Mapungubwe. So now, why did this kingdom end? So it has been suggested that the natural resources of ivory and gold were depleted. Perhaps the kingdom could have fallen in battle with other people. Maybe the Arabs cut off trade and found other trading partners. So the kingdom of Mapungubwe was already in decline by the late 13th century CE, probably because of the overpopulation that put too much stress on local resources, a situation that may have been brought to a crisis point by a series of droughts. Trade routes may have also been shifted northwards and local resources run out. The kingdoms that now prospered were to the north, such as Great Zimbabwe, and then the Kingdom of Mutapa in northern Zimbabwe and southern Zambia. The decline could have been climatic. The Little Ice Age spread from Europe, and its biggest impact started at about 1300 AD. It made things go cold and dry. This would have made it hard to grow anything in Mapungubwe. This would mean they were no longer able to sustain the growing population and they would have to leave. The political successes of Mapungubwe were Great Zimbabwe. Okay, so now after the abandonment of Mapungubwe, about AD 1320, the Limpopo Valley was actually reoccupied by Sotho people, making what we call icon pottery, and then by Kalanga speakers making kami pottery. So the Limpopo Valley and the landscape remained unoccupied by agriculturists for some 80 years until early Sotho people took up residence. The senior Kalanga chief, in this case Twamamba, was based on the Machema about 60 kilometers to the south, while several petty chiefs administered various portions of the valley itself. Because of fluctuating rainfall, the occupations of both Sotho and Kalanga people occurred in pulses during the higher rainfall period. Kalanga people occupied the best agricultural land near the Limpopo floodplains, and Sotho people lived on the plateau to the south. The two groups thus shared the landscape, but not the resources equally. This interaction was facilitated by male and female initiation schools on the ethnic boundary, helped to create Venda as a language. So interaction between Sotho, which is said icon pottery, and the Kalanga kami pottery over some 200 years led to the creation of Venda. With a probable origin in East Africa, icon pottery marks the first appearance of Sotho speakers in Southern Africa. Shortly afterwards, Kalanga speakers, which are Western Shona, who made kami pottery, moved south from Zimbabwe and reoccupied the valley. It was their ancestors who had lived in Mapungubwe. So now, interaction between Sotho and Kalanga people is of a special interest because it led to the creation of Venda as a language and macrocultural entity. Venda people are archaeologically and anthropologically important because they have continued the essence of the pre-colonial Zimbabwe culture, class-in-class distinction and sacred leadership, distinguishing them further from Sotho and Nguni-speaking communities. The Tshivenda language is known to be a unique blend of Shona, both Kalanga and Karanga, and Sotho. Previous research near the South Spansberg shows the creation of Tshivenda parallels the creation of Letaba Venda ceramics from a blend of icon, Sotho, and Kami Kalanga pottery. So we're going to look at the Mapungubwe sequence. Two conditions were critical for the development of hereditary social classes. First, a sufficiently large population needed in order to have marked social differentiation. So normally such a large population was supported by extensive cultivation. During the Middle Iron Age, rainfall was more reliable than today in the Shasha-Limpopo Valley, and the two rivers probably flooded seasonally. When the Shasha flooded, it creates a barrier against the Limpopo, causing the Limpopo to back up and flood low-lying areas, as well as replenish alluvial soils downstream. Now, as a result, farmers had access to the two prime agricultural zones east and west of Mapungubwe. The cultivation of these zones would then contribute to what? A population increase. The second critical factor was a surplus in prestige goods that elite could control, thus creating marked differences in wealth. We know that wealth in cattle was insufficient. Many cattle-rich societies do not develop interstates, so long distance made a big difference. The Indian Ocean gold and ivory trade in Zimbabwe began in the Zizo period, reaching the Shasha-Limpopo Valley by the 10th century. In the early 11th century, Leopold Kopje people took over this trade from the ancient Zizo chiefdoms, causing the Zizo political elite to move west. Okay, in conclusion, the period of 400 years from the start of Shroda to the decline of Mapungubwe evolved the first highly organized and civilized society in Southern Africa. The Great Kingdom came to an abrupt end in the 13th century. By the end of the 13th century, the majority of the population of Mapungubwe dispersed east to join people who would eventually constitute the Venda Nation, and others moved north. The Mapungubwe cultural landscape records the sequence of spatial changes that reflect the evolution of class distinction and sacred leadership in the settlement from Shronda to K2 and Mapungubwe. Great Zimbabwe, which began about 1100 CE adopted and refined most of the Mapungubwe social, political, and economic patterns on a much larger scale. By the 15th century, this great Zimbabwe had fallen. The dispersal of people after the reign of Zimbabwe would give rise to other states. The structures of Mapungubwe were handed down through generations, and traces can be found in different parts of Venda today. For example, in its type of sacred leadership. So guys, it is important we study these great kingdoms for many reasons. Mapungubwe is a natural treasure holding the history of 50,000 years of human development. Like the people of Mapungubwe, today we face various economic, political, and social environmental crises. People in this area, they interacted, they cooperated, and fought with one another long before South Africa was colonized. Understanding this history can perhaps help us shape the way that we interact with each other today. Thank you so much for attending this lecture. Enjoy the rest of your day.